The night sky over Sanaa was supposed to be quiet, a city weary of war but still clinging to the illusion of normalcy. Then, without warning, it was ripped apart. A thunderclap of fire tore through the heart of the Yemeni capital, lighting the rooftops in blinding flashes. Windows rattled, children screamed, and the echoes of sirens cut into the smoke-filled air. Within minutes, the world's newsrooms carried a headline that stunned even the most hardened observers: Houthi Prime Minister Killed in Israeli Strike. For years, the Houthis had spoken with unshakable confidence, daring their enemies to strike at them, boasting that their leadership was untouchable. They believed their power in Sanaa was ironclad, that the underground meeting rooms where their ministers gathered were safe havens against the most advanced military machines. But in a single, ruthless moment, that illusion shattered. Israel had done what many thought impossible. It had pierced the very core of the Houthi leadership. And it wasn't just the Prime Minister, Ahmed Gailb al-Rahawi. Reports trickled in suggesting that his cabinet, men who commanded the daily machinery of Houthi power, were also inside. Entire ministries, gone in one instant. A whole government, silenced beneath the rubble of a single strike. The audacity of it shocked allies and adversaries alike. This wasn't simply a military operation. It was a political earthquake. Think of the symbolism: the Houthis, who cast themselves as the spearhead of defiance, losing their top leaders in one night. Think of the message: Israel, striking with precision hundreds of miles beyond its borders, saying to the region, no fortress is beyond reach. And think of the risk: for every target eliminated, 1,000 new questions explode. What comes next? Retaliation. Wider war. A reshuffling of power in a land already drowning in conflict? For millions watching from afar, the scene carried the aura of history being written in real time. It was not merely a headline. It was the kind of event that redraws maps, hardens ideologies, and etches itself into memory. Yemen's night of fire was more than a battle. It was the beginning of something far larger. Because what Israel believed it achieved in that single night could ignite a chain reaction no one is ready for. For most of the world, Yemen had long been reduced to a distant headline, a forgotten war, a footnote in the endless conflicts of the Middle East. But that illusion crumbled the moment fire rained down on Sanaa. Suddenly, a country many had ignored became the epicenter of a confrontation that could redraw the region's future. Because this wasn't just another strike, and it wasn't just another casualty. This was a message, sharp, deliberate, and aimed at the heart of power. To understand why the world sat up in shock, you have to picture the stakes. Yemen isn't merely a poor, war-torn country. It is a gatekeeper. Through the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait flows nearly a tenth of the world's trade, a lifeline of oil and goods connecting Asia to Europe. And the Houthis, armed, emboldened, and defiant, had turned that lifeline into their own battlefield. Ships attacked, tankers harassed, drones launched into the skies as if daring the world to stop them. Israel, reliant on those sea routes and already facing fire from Lebanon and Gaza, could not afford to let a new front go unanswered. That's what made this night different. For months, Israel had struck at launch sites, warehouses, and weapons caches. Always infrastructure, always the machinery of war. But this time, the target wasn't a missile. It wasn't a drone. It was the government itself, the men who gave the orders, the officials who claimed to rule. By aiming at the Houthis' political nerve center, Israel escalated the shadow war into something far more direct, far more dangerous. And yet, beyond the headlines, the questions burn hotter. Did Israel just eliminate its enemy's brain trust, or did it spark a fire that will consume more than it contains? Because for the Houthis, this was no ordinary loss. This was humiliation. It was a public stripping of power, the kind of wound that demands vengeance. And vengeance, in a region already primed with rivalries and grudges, spreads faster than wildfire. Think about what comes next. Iran, the Houthis' longtime backer, watching its ally decapitated in one night. The Arab Street, where resentment of Israel already runs deep, electrified by images of a destroyed cabinet hall. Global powers, from Washington to Moscow, calculating whether this strike stabilizes or destabilizes. Each reaction layers onto the next, building a chain of consequences that no one can fully control. This is why the world cannot look away. Because one Israeli missile may have killed more than a handful of men, it may have awakened forces that redraw alliances, topple strategies, and set the region on a collision course with something far bigger. And the irony. In trying to silence its enemy, Israel may have given the Houthis their loudest weapon yet, the power of martyrdom, the narrative of leaders killed for standing against a stronger foe. Already, whispers from Sanaa call the dead ministers martyrs of resistance, voices that will echo louder than their policies ever did. What began as a strike may soon become a symbol. And symbols, unlike men, cannot be buried so easily. But while the world braced for what might come next, another story began to unfold, a story not about the missiles in the sky, but about the men who commanded them. Because to understand the scale of this moment, you have to look deeper into the antagonists themselves, their arrogance, their contradictions, and the very hubris that set them up for a fall. To grasp the magnitude of what happened in Sanaa, we need to understand the men who were targeted, their rise, their power, and the contradictions that made them both feared and resented. Because the Houthis were never just another faction in Yemen's long civil war. They styled themselves as guardians of resistance, champions of the oppressed, standing tall against Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the United States. But behind the slogans lay a reality built on arrogance, ambition, and a belief that their authority could not be touched. The Houthis began as a small movement in Yemen's northern mountains, born from decades of poverty, marginalization, and resentment against central rulers. They called themselves Ansar Allah, the supporters of God, and quickly wrapped their fight in religious zeal. By 2014, they had swept into the capital, toppling the internationally recognized government and declaring their rule. From that day on, they moved with the swagger of victors who believed history had chosen them. Their leaders, the Prime Minister, the Ministers of Defense, Interior, Foreign Affairs, sat in Sanaa's chambers speaking as though their government was unshakable. They ruled with an iron fist over millions of Yemenis, tightening control on media, policing speech, and extracting resources from a starving population. Yet in public, they posed as revolutionaries, fighters against imperialism, voices of justice. The contradiction was glaring, claiming to fight for the people while crushing dissent at home. Still, for their supporters, they were heroes, underdogs standing against giants. But the real power of the Houthis wasn't just their guns or their propaganda. It was their connection to Iran. From Tehran they received training, missiles, drones, the technology that allowed them to punch far above their weight. With every new weapon, their arrogance grew. They struck ships in the Red Sea as if daring the world to challenge them. They launched drones toward Israel, confident the symbolism alone made them untouchable. Their leaders gave speeches dripping with bravado, mocking their enemies and promising that their resistance would never bow. That arrogance became their shield. They believed geography was on their side, that Sanaa was too far, too fortified for Israel to ever risk an attack. They believed that targeting infrastructure was the ceiling of Israeli retaliation, that their government meetings, their cabinet gatherings, were beyond reach. So secure were they in this belief that on that fateful night, they assembled their ministers under one roof, unguarded, complacent, as though war existed everywhere except within their own walls. But hubris is often the first step to downfall. Their contradictions, oppressing Yemenis while preaching freedom, risking escalation while claiming to defend peace, made them vulnerable. And when the strike came, it ripped through not only their building, but their aura of invincibility. For years they had cast themselves as untouchable symbols of resistance. In one night, they were reduced to rubble and uncertainty. And yet, the story of the Houthis as antagonists isn't simple. To their supporters, these same contradictions are framed as courage. Their arrogance is painted as defiance, their recklessness as bravery. Every attack on a ship, every missile launch, is spun into proof that they alone dare to stand where others falter. In their narrative, they are David against Goliath, fighting not just Israel, but an entire global system aligned against them. That is why their downfall carries such weight. Because the Houthis weren't just rulers, they were icons. Their destruction isn't merely the loss of a government. It's the collapse of a symbol that millions believed in and millions more despised. It's the unraveling of a story carefully woven over a decade of war. But history is never one-sided. To see the full picture, we cannot only look at the villains, their arrogance and contradictions. We must also understand those on the other side, the ones who carried out the strike, the ones who framed it as a mission of necessity, the ones who believed they were defending not just their borders, but the very idea of survival. Because where there is arrogance, there is also calculation. Where there is hubris, there is sacrifice. And in the shadows of this conflict stands another story, the story of those who prepared for this moment, and the heroism that set the stage for the strike that shook the world. Heroes in war are not always the ones who hold the loudest podiums or the highest titles. Sometimes, they are the silent figures in dimly lit rooms, sifting through scraps of intelligence. Sometimes, they are the pilots who sit in steel cockpits, heartbeat steady, knowing that a single wrong move could ignite chaos. And sometimes, they are the civilians who endure the weight of bombs and blockades, surviving each day with nothing but resilience. In the story of this strike, all three strands of heroism intertwine: Israeli officers, Israeli pilots, and the ordinary Yemenis who have carried on under impossible conditions. For months before the strike, intelligence operatives worked in shadows. They intercepted whispers, tracked convoys, analyzed satellite images that showed the comings and goings at government compounds in Sanaa. Every piece of information was a fragment of a puzzle that might reveal when and where the Houthi leadership would gather. It was a task of patience and discipline. They knew the Houthis had grown arrogant, but arrogance does not make men careless every day. Waiting for the moment when overconfidence turned into vulnerability required a kind of persistence few would notice, and even fewer would honor. Meanwhile, in air bases far from the chaos of Yemen, Israeli pilots were briefed. They were told of the stakes, not merely a strike on infrastructure, but a mission to cut into the very heart of the Houthi leadership. These were not men unfamiliar with risk. They had flown missions over Gaza, over Lebanon, over Syria. But this was different. This was a mission hundreds of miles away, over terrain swarming with anti-aircraft defenses, far from friendly support. Each pilot strapped in with the knowledge that success would rewrite the map of a war, and failure could trigger a wider inferno. Yet to frame the story only through Israel's eyes would be incomplete. Because in Sanaa, in Hodeidah, in Taiz, ordinary Yemenis were living through the collateral realities of this conflict. They were mothers carrying children through streets with no electricity. They were fathers digging wells to find water in villages where taps had long run dry. They were teenagers scrolling through cracked phones, reading news that told them nothing but despair. These were people who had endured years of bombings, sieges, hunger. Their heroism was quieter but no less profound, the simple act of surviving when the world seemed intent on forgetting them. It is here that the paradox emerges. For Israel, the strike was about security, a preemptive defense against an enemy launching drones and missiles toward its borders. For ordinary Yemenis, it was another night of explosions, another reminder that their lives were the battlefield on which powerful actors waged their struggles. And yet, even in that paradox lies resilience. Because every time Sanaa was hit, people picked up the pieces. Every time leaders fell, life went on. Markets reopened, children returned to class, prayers rose from mosques that had withstood the rubble. In their endurance, there was a different kind of defiance, a refusal to let war extinguish life itself. The Israeli officers who pieced together the intelligence knew this too. They were not blind to the civilians caught in the crossfire. That is why the planning was meticulous, the precision emphasized. This was to be a strike not against neighborhoods or crowds, but against the nerve center of a regime. Every coordinate was checked, every probability of collateral weighed. In their minds, this wasn't simply about killing enemies, it was about delivering a message with surgical clarity. We can reach you, but we need not destroy all around you to do so. Pilots, too, carried the burden of conscience. They had families back home, children asleep in Tel Aviv or Haifa, who they prayed would never know the sound of warplanes overhead. They flew into the night knowing that their mission was not just about retaliation, but about ensuring those children never became targets themselves. Heroism for them was not in pulling the trigger, but in holding steady, carrying the weight of responsibility on their shoulders. And then, all these threads, the silent officers, the watchful pilots, the enduring civilians, converged on a single night. Intelligence marked the meeting. Pilots readied their aircraft. Civilians in Sanaa, unaware of what loomed above, prepared for sleep. The stage was set. The arrogance of one side, the persistence of another, the suffering of the innocent, all collided in a moment when history paused, drew in a breath, and waited. Because when the target finally revealed itself, the decision was made. Engines roared to life, crosshairs locked in, and in that instant, decades of conflict condensed into a single choice. And as the missiles left their wings and arced across the darkened skies, history itself shifted. And when the target finally revealed itself, the decision was made. History would change in an instant. In the hours before the strike, the air was thick with hesitation. Inside Israel's war cabinet, the debate was urgent, sharp, almost electric. Maps stretched across the table, satellite images glowing on screens, each voice carrying the weight of a different future. Some argued caution, reminding everyone of the geopolitical tinderbox, the potential backlash from Tehran, from Washington, from the streets of the Arab world. Others pressed forward, convinced that hesitation was weakness, that the Houthis' unchecked defiance would only embolden greater threats tomorrow. Every voice rose and fell against the rhythm of a ticking clock. For Israel, this wasn't simply another battlefield. The Houthis were more than a distant militia. They were a proxy stretching the reach of Iran into the Red Sea, into the Gulf of Aden, into the very arteries of global trade. Every missile they launched at shipping lanes, every drone that buzzed across borders, was not just an act of defiance, it was a reminder that no corner of the region was beyond their reach. To ignore them was to invite escalation. To strike them was to risk it. The balance trembled on a knife's edge. Across the globe, analysts and commentators dissected the moment with nervous anticipation. On late-night news panels, voices collided. Was Israel about to overreach? Would this be the strike that dragged the region into a wider war? Some warned of chaos spilling into the Gulf, into Lebanon, into every fragile thread of Middle Eastern politics. Others whispered that it might be the bold stroke needed to force the Houthis into retreat. Each word carried speculation, but no one truly knew how far the dominoes might fall once the first one tipped. Meanwhile, in Sanaa, the mood was entirely different. Inside dimly lit offices and candlelit homes, the Houthi leadership celebrated another day of survival. Their broadcasts boomed with defiance, their speeches laced with bravado. "We are still standing," they declared, "while our enemies cower." They paraded their weapons in front of cameras, sent fiery messages of resistance to their followers, and wrapped themselves in the language of destiny. To them, each passing day without a direct strike on their leadership was proof of divine protection. They did not see the storm gathering just beyond their horizon. But even among the Houthis, unease lingered beneath the surface. Some whispered about the dangers of overexposure. Some questioned the wisdom of meeting in predictable patterns, in the same rooms, under the same roofs. Yet pride is a powerful cloak. Surrounded by loyalists, shielded by rhetoric, the leadership convinced itself that the enemy would not dare. That illusion, in the end, was the deadliest mistake. The world beyond Yemen buzzed with anticipation, though no one outside the highest levels of Israeli command truly knew what was about to unfold. Diplomats worked late-night phones, analysts refreshed newswires, generals in other capitals recalibrated their own strategies. The tension was not confined to the Middle East, it radiated outward, across oceans, into boardrooms and parliaments where the question was whispered. What happens if Israel pulls the trigger? Inside Israel's war cabinet, the debate sharpened to its final edge. Risk was acknowledged. Consequences were measured. But against every warning rose the undeniable truth. Opportunities like this did not come often. Intelligence was rarely this clear, timing rarely this perfect. To wait could mean losing the chance forever. To act could mean rewriting the course of the conflict. The decision hung suspended in the air, as though the room itself was holding its breath. And then, silence. Agreement. The order was given. Thousands of miles away, in the quiet streets of Sanaa, the night carried on as though nothing were amiss. Children slept. Traders closed their stalls. Families gathered around television screens filled with speeches of defiance, unaware that their city's sky was about to change forever. The war cabinet's arguments, the analysts' warnings, the Houthis' bravado, all converged in the stillness of that single night. The countdown had begun. The clock was no longer ticking forward, it was racing downward, toward impact. And then, the sky over Sanaa lit up. The night over Sanaa was unusually still, as though the city itself had paused to draw breath. Then, from the darkness beyond the horizon, a low hum began to grow. At first, it was barely noticeable, a vibration in the air, a faint ripple carried by the wind. But soon it swelled into a chorus of precision, drones slicing silently, jets roaring at high altitude, machines of war moving with the discipline of a surgeon's scalpel. They were not there to intimidate. They were there to end something. Inside the capital, the Houthi leadership was gathered in confident routine. Ministers clustered around tables, trading speeches about resistance, drafting plans of defiance, toasting the resilience of their movement. The atmosphere was thick with certainty, with the aura of invincibility that had shielded them for years. To them, the walls of Sanaa were unbreachable, their positions untouchable. But above them, unseen in the midnight sky, their fate was already decided. The first strike came without warning. A streak of fire tore downward, splitting the stillness with a thunderclap that shook the earth. Windows shattered for miles. The ground itself convulsed as if recoiling from the force. In an instant, the room where speeches of defiance had echoed was gone, swallowed in an eruption of light, steel, and fury. The cabinet table, the flags on the walls, the very symbols of authority vanished into smoke and rubble. Seconds later, more blasts followed. Precision-guided munitions fell in sequence, cutting through rooftops, detonating with merciless rhythm. The air was filled with dust, flame, and the shrill wail of sirens that arrived too late. A skyline that had stood in defiance now burned in silence. Within minutes, the heart of Houthi leadership, Prime Minister, ministers, advisors, was reduced to ash and fragments. What years of negotiations, sanctions, and proxy wars had failed to achieve, one coordinated strike had delivered in seconds. For those who lived near the impact zone, disbelief was the first reaction. Crowds gathered in the haze of fire and dust, staring at the ruins where they had seen ministers enter only hours before. Some wept openly, others stood frozen in shock. Rumors raced ahead of facts. Was it an ammunition depot? A foreign embassy? No one wanted to believe the truth, that the untouchable had finally been touched, that the rulers who spoke of destiny and divine protection had fallen in silence and flame. On Houthi-controlled media channels, the silence was deafening. Broadcasters who had spent years issuing fiery proclamations now stammered, searching for words. Screens filled with generic messages of resistance while anchors avoided naming names. Panic was hidden behind forced calm. In private channels, officials scrambled to verify who was alive, who was missing, who was gone. But with every unanswered call, every cut connection, the picture grew clearer. The cabinet was gone, and with it, the illusion of permanence. Then came Israel's voice, calm and measured, delivered with surgical clarity. From the podium in Tel Aviv, a spokesperson appeared, the tone devoid of theatrics. Tonight, the statement began, we struck the leadership of a terrorist regime. No shouting, no gloating, just the blunt finality of a nation that had done what it said it would. The words landed like a MIC drop, echoing across screens and airwaves worldwide. For Israel, it was a message beyond Yemen. It was a declaration that no hostile force, however distant, however entrenched, was safe from reach. For the Houthis, it was humiliation beyond measure. Years of propaganda had painted them as untouchable warriors, their leadership wrapped in divine armor. Now, in a single night, that armor was shattered, the myth exposed as smoke rose over their capital. But as the fires smoldered, questions lingered. Had the strike truly wiped out the entire cabinet? Intelligence sources whispered yes, with high confidence. Satellite images showed obliterated compounds, intercepted communications suggested chaos, absence of leadership was clear. And yet, uncertainty gnawed at the edges. Could someone have survived? Could a figure emerge from the rubble to claim continuity, to deny defeat? In war, truth is always shadowed by the unknown. On the streets of Sanaa, whispers filled the night. Some dared to cheer quietly, believing they had witnessed the end of a corrupt rule. Others trembled, fearing what retaliation might come. Families huddled together, radios pressed to ears, waiting for confirmation, for clarity. But clarity did not come. Only the silence of leadership, the absence of the voices that once thundered with promises of resistance. The impact rippled far beyond Yemen. In Tehran, the blow was felt like a shockwave, their proxy leadership seemingly decapitated in an instant. In Washington, the strike was met with uneasy admiration and deep concern. In Riyadh and Abu Dhabi, there was quiet satisfaction, tempered by fear of escalation. Every capital read the same message. Israel had acted decisively, and nothing would be the same again. The strike was more than an act of war. It was theater on a global stage. It reminded enemies and allies alike that history can pivot not in years, not in months, but in minutes. And yet, beneath the clean narrative of victory, unease lingered. Because even as rubble smoked and bodies were counted, the question hung in the air, what comes next? And what Israel believed it achieved in that single night could ignite a chain reaction no one is ready for. The smoke had barely cleared from Sanaa when the first confirmation appeared. A somber message, buried in the rhetoric of defiance, carried words the world had been waiting for. Houthi Prime Minister Ahmed Ghaib al-Rahawi was dead. What had started as speculation, whispers, and unverified claims now became fact. The heart of the Houthi government had been struck, and the confirmation rippled outward like a stone dropped in still water. Social media ignited instantly. Within minutes, hashtags like #SanaaStrike, #HouthIsHit, and #Rahawadead were trending across platforms. On TikTok and Instagram, short clips of the explosion, shaky, grainy footage taken by ordinary Yemenis, circulated with millions of views. Memes flooded Twitter, edited images of a burning cabinet table, captions mocking Houthi propaganda slogans. Some users hailed it as justice served. Others mourned it as a dark day for Yemen. The digital battlefield was almost as fierce as the one in the skies. Across the Arab world, reactions were divided. In Riyadh, satellite channels broadcast the story with quiet satisfaction, subtly framing it as a blow against Iran's influence. In Cairo, analysts debated the long-term impact, warning that Yemen might spiral further into chaos. In Baghdad and Beirut, commentators sympathetic to the Houthis framed the strike as an assassination, accusing Israel of pushing the region toward catastrophe. But nowhere was the outrage louder than in Tehran. Iranian state television condemned the attack as an act of terrorism, vowing that the resistance will not forget. In Israel, the mood was starkly different. Supporters hailed the strike as one of the most successful operations in years. Newspapers ran bold headlines, "Cabinet gone in one night." "No safe haven for terrorists." Talk shows praised the intelligence community, the pilots, the precision of the operation. On social media, Israelis posted celebratory messages, some even sharing clips of fireworks displays with captions like, "This is what justice looks like." But amid the jubilation and outrage, the world's analysts urged caution. Military experts on CNN and Al Jazeera spoke of the Red Sea flashpoint, warning that the Houthis, even leaderless, still had the capability to launch drones and missiles at shipping lanes, oil infrastructure, or even Israeli territory itself. European think tanks released urgent reports, warning that escalation could choke one of the world's most vital trade arteries. Diplomats in Washington and Brussels whispered about regional war. Even outside policy circles, the strike dominated global conversation. Late-night hosts in New York cracked grim jokes. Israel just RSVP'd the entire Houthi cabinet to a meeting in the afterlife. Influencers on YouTube uploaded breakdown videos with titles like "Did Israel just change the Middle East forever?" Hashtags morphed into slogans, #vengeance or victory and #Middle East on edge. The story wasn't just news anymore, it was culture, commentary, entertainment, fear, and speculation all at once. In Sanaa, however, there was nothing entertaining about the aftermath. Families searched hospitals for missing relatives. Streets remained shrouded in smoke. The shock of the strike gave way to unease, as residents wondered what would come next. Some whispered prayers of relief that a government they despised was gone. Others trembled at the thought of retaliation, knowing that vengeance, when it came, would be indiscriminate. The Arab press filled with images of mourning, portraits of Rahawi draped in black ribbons, footage of Houthi supporters marching in funerals, fists raised in defiance. The message was clear: the movement would not collapse. Instead, it would rise again, fueled by martyrdom. Yet beneath the chants and slogans, uncertainty lingered. Without its leadership, could the Houthis truly hold power? Or would splinter factions tear them apart from within? Around the globe, governments scrambled to respond. The United Nations issued a cautious statement urging restraint on all sides. Washington released a carefully worded message praising Israel's right to defend itself, while urging de-escalation. Moscow, Beijing, and Ankara each condemned the strike, framing it as destabilizing. Diplomats rushed behind the scenes, fearing that one-night success could unravel into months of conflict. The world held its breath. Everyone sensed that this was more than just another battle in a distant war. It was a trigger, a spark, a moment that could redraw alliances, reopen wars thought buried, and destabilize an entire region. And then came the vow. From the heart of Sanaa, through clenched teeth and raised fists, the Houthis broadcast a promise to the world: vengeance. Their leaders declared that Israel would pay a price in blood, that the Red Sea would burn with fire, that the strike would not be the end of the Houthis but the beginning of a storm. The promise was clear, chilling, and open-ended. A vow that hung over the region like a shadow. Because history had shifted. And the question now was not whether the Houthis could strike back, but when and how far it would go. The dust of Sanaa still hung heavy in the air when the world began to search for meaning. Headlines, hashtags, and declarations had captured the drama of the strike, but beyond the smoke and ruins, a deeper truth emerged. This was never just about the death of a man, or the obliteration of a cabinet. It was about the forces that drive nations into conflict: power, arrogance, fear, and the endless cycle of retaliation. The Israeli strike proved something both terrifying and undeniable: leadership is fragile. In a single night, years of authority and influence collapsed into rubble. The Houthis, once so confident in their survival, learned that no bunker is truly safe. Israel, flexing its military precision, reminded the world that when it chooses to act, it can reshape the battlefield instantly. And yet, in this display of dominance, an old truth whispered back: power can kill, but it cannot guarantee peace. For ordinary Yemenis, this truth has been lived for years. Families displaced, children orphaned, futures stolen. To them, the death of a prime minister changes little. The bombs still fall, the hunger still spreads, and the hope of peace still feels like a mirage. Their suffering is the silent lesson of this war. While leaders gamble with vengeance, it is always the innocent who pay the heaviest price. Across the region, people asked themselves what this moment meant. Supporters hailed it as justice. Detractors condemned it as tyranny. But beneath the noise, the moral lesson cut sharper than the blast of any missile: wealth without dignity is slavery. Power without justice is corruption. For too long, nations have sought power for its own sake, hoarding weapons, funding proxies, striking rivals. Yet without justice, without respect for human life, this pursuit of power corrodes from within. The Houthis believed their defiance made them untouchable. Israel believed its strike would cement its dominance. Both reveal the same truth: arrogance blinds leaders to their own fragility. Thrones built on violence sit on sand, not stone. In the deserts of Yemen and the skies over Israel, history shows again and again that no victory is final, no regime is permanent, no power is absolute. And what of vengeance? The Houthis' vow to retaliate may ignite another round of bloodshed. But vengeance, history teaches, never heals. It only multiplies grief, widens wounds, and drags nations deeper into the abyss. The missiles that roar from one side summon drones from the other. Each retaliation promises justice, but delivers only new funerals. This is the cycle that has kept the Middle East in turmoil for generations, a cycle that only courage, not firepower, can break. Yet, even amid the tragedy, there is a lesson of resilience. Ordinary people, Yemeni families praying under shattered roofs, Israeli civilians bracing against rocket sirens, remind us that survival is also a form of resistance. Their quiet perseverance speaks louder than the rhetoric of leaders. They embody the hope that someday, dignity and peace might prevail over arrogance and war. The Israeli strike on the Houthi leadership will be remembered as a turning point. But history will not only judge the strike itself. It will judge what followed, whether the region spiraled into fire, or whether leaders finally recognized the futility of endless revenge. The choice remains unwritten, waiting in the hands of those who govern and those who resist. And so, the story ends where it began, not with the roar of jets or the collapse of buildings, but with a question of meaning. What does power achieve if it cannot bring justice? What is victory worth if it only breeds another war? In the deserts of Yemen and the skies over Israel, history is being written. Written in smoke and fire, yes, but also in lessons older than empires. Lessons that remind us, in war, no throne is permanent, and no power is absolute.